We'll just go ahead and get started here. We might have more people be joining us as we begin, and I'm going to start my video. But we obviously are sharing a PowerPoint with you all today, so you'll be seeing that throughout. Really great to have you all on tonight. We had sent this around to all members throughout the country, and we had quite a few people RSVP. But obviously not everyone will be able to join. And just so you all know, we will be sending around the slides and the recording of tonight's presentation after. So tonight we're going to hear from a few members of the Amnesty family about the vital importance of humanitarian aid and the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. But before I do that, I want to provide a few reminders on logistics. So please, everyone, mute yourself if you're not speaking. I'm not going to automatically mute everyone just to make this easier, but if we do have background noise, I will go ahead and mute everyone. But hopefully I don't have to do that. And just so you know, if I mute everyone, all you have to do is unmute yourself. It's not like you're forced to be on mute forever. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask the question. And I'm going to make sure we provide opportunities for questions throughout. And again, we're going to be recording tonight, and we'll be sending around the PowerPoint to everyone who signed up to participate. If you also registered in advance for the in-district action, you should have received the materials that we'll be referencing in your email, but don't worry, we will send those around to everyone as well in case you missed it. So with that, I'm going to go on to the next slide. And I do not know why why there's markings on the screen, so I will try to get rid of that. But I want to go ahead and introduce the speakers that we're going to hear from tonight. We're going to hear from Denise Bell. She's Amnesty International USA's lead researcher on refugee issues. We have Ashley, who's our tactical campaign manager. We have Sarah Ahmed, our Texas legislative coordinator. And then you will hear from myself as well. And I work on grassroots advocacy, and I also am on the government relations team for leading the refugee lobbying here in DC. Here is a run of show of what we're going to be hearing about. We're going to be hearing about the crisis of historic proportions, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, humanitarian aid. We're going to provide you a case example which Amnesty is actively campaigning on now to ensure that when you're talking about humanitarian aid and U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, you actually can provide an actual case of someone who benefits from this funding and would, if as you'll hear, would benefit from the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program if he were allowed to come. We're also going to hear about our asks that we're going to be asking members of Congress, our counter-arguments, arguments you might need to use in those meetings, and who are our targets. Then we're going to hear from Sarah with hearing a legislative coordinator's perspective. And again, we'll have a last round of questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Denise. And I just wanted to make sure we started off with this quote from the UN High Commissioner. So I'll leave that up, and I will turn it over to Denise Bell.
Thank you, Ryan, and hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to talk about this crisis, and more importantly, what we're doing on the campaign to tackle this crisis. And I'm coming from a place of hope and power. Because we are, as Ashley will tell you, designing bold and visionary campaigns so that people feel like they are directly part of the solution and we can together solve this refugee crisis. Ryan, I have one tactical question. Are you going to advance the slides or do I?
I will.
Okay, great. Okay, so first I just want to give an overview. of what exactly we're talking about, the problem. And as you can see, it is a crisis of historic proportions. Many people probably have heard that we're living in the greatest refugee crisis since World War II. And that means while there's more than 65 million people who have been forced to flee their homes for a variety of reasons, of those, 22.5 are refugees. And more than half of them are children, which is an extraordinary number. And they are in dire need. They need shelter, housing, they need medical treatment, they need food and other life-saving, life-sustaining services. And that's part of what this humanitarian aid that Ryan will be talking about will go toward. And so when we think of these very large numbers, what does this mean? I want to put it in very human terms as well. Like, it's a very solvable problem. Fewer than 1% of refugees will ever be considered for resettlement. And that's 1%, and that's even less who are actually resettled. And in the US, well, worldwide last year, there were 160,000 refugees who were resettled. That is, I did the math, 0.3% of the world's population. I mean, it's a very solvable issue. But right now, what we're facing is an even worse crisis because US policies are worsening the problem. Because of cuts to our refugee admissions policy, we are going to admit maybe 20 to 22,000 refugees. So to put this in context, fewer than 1% of the world's refugees will ever be considered for resettlement. Of that number last year, we had maybe 160,000 refugees around the world who went to third countries to find new homes. Once the US, under the current administration, issued a series of refugee bans and new policies targeting refugees based on their country of origin and their religion, discriminatory policies, we have found that world leaders, that other countries that resettle refugees have drastically stepped back their commitments. And resettlement slots are down by more than 60%. So whereas last year we had 160,000 refugees perhaps who found new homes, this year we're looking at fewer than 70,000 in the world will find a new home. And that is directly related to the US stepping back. When we step back, other countries don't step in to fill the gaps, to take the refugees who didn't find a new home. They are stuck abroad in danger. And so as Ryan has put up, what we have is in the last year, I'll give you a little context, in the last year of the Obama administration, we resettled 85,000 refugees. That was probably half of the world's refugees. Again, a very small number, very doable. Under President, and we were supposed to resettle 110. And what we were doing was expanding on the US's commitment to refugee rights, to the human rights of refugees. Because we could, and we were getting stronger and stronger. This administration has sought to cut refugee admissions. And last year we had 53,000 refugees admitted. This year, the president set the refugee admission cap at the lowest level ever set at 45,000. We're not at halfway through the year, we haven't even reached halfway to that goal. That's a 75% decrease. This disproportionately affects Muslim refugees, 90% reduction in rate. And so when we speak about a discriminatory policy, when we speak about policies targeting refugees, the numbers bear this out. And so what we are effectively seeing is a dismantling of the refugee admissions program through bans and policies that use a measure of security screening procedures to keep people out. Are there any questions before I move on? I know that's a lot of information, or should I hold Ryan?
Hold questions until you
Okay. And so the next slide shows in states and actually what we're doing when you're out and talking in district. Again, these are very solvable issues. We hear 22.5 million people. We hear 1%. We hear 160. We hear 45. You can see the numbers and where refugees are going. This is a very solvable problem in terms of helping people. States can take in more. If a member of Congress says, oh, there are so many refugees, Mississippi has 2 refugees. I just met with a member of Congress and we talked about that. So this is a solvable problem. But to solve this problem, it's both a matter of numbers, telling our elected officials that we support the refugee admissions program, that they have to do everything they can to make sure the administration admits the 45,000 refugees this year, supports 75,000 for next year, and provides the funding to make sure that refugees' rights are protected abroad and here when they come to the US. The next slide gives the numbers again, but I would like to point out something that would be a helpful talking point, when you're meeting with members of Congress. It's also a powerful foreign policy tool. And the reason this is that a lot of our allies rely on us, both to provide the funding for the camps and refugee support services in countries like Jordan, for example, or Turkey, where many refugees are fleeing. But not just there. In other countries of the world, this is truly a global refugee crisis. The largest refugee camp in the world is in Kenya. You will probably have heard about the Rohingya refugee crisis, where many refugees fleeing Myanmar and going into Bangladesh. Amnesty has documented that. We need refugee supports there. Many people don't realize that Chad, one of the poorest countries on the world, has refugees from 4 surrounding countries, Democratic Republic of Congo, Niger, South Sudan, and Uganda. The refugee crisis is truly global. And at our back door, we have the refugee crisis in Central America. So when we help refugees, we're helping them, but we're helping our allies. And this is something that will resonate with members of Congress when they understand it's in their own interest too, to make sure that we are protecting the rights of refugees.
Great. Thank you, Denise. And before I open it up to questions, I just want to go back to this slide and just say again that this is refugee arrivals at the halfway point of the fiscal year. So if you look at Alabama, that FY17 fiscal year 17 number 41 is how many refugees were admitted in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. 8 is how many in that same this year. We will share this graph out in the email that I referenced. So with that, again, we're going to have a few other sections, but if there's any burning questions right now, please feel free to ask. To start, Larry asked, when did the fiscal year start? Larry, that's a great question. So the government's fiscal year runs from the start of October through the end of September. So October 1st is when the fiscal year starts. And Congress, so obviously April 1st was the halfway point, and that's when all of these numbers were run. Okay, great. Well, if there's no more questions at this moment, we're going to move on to the next. So now that we've heard about the importance of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, I'm going to speak briefly about how does the U.S. provide humanitarian assistance to refugees and displaced persons. Well, the U.S. provides critical aid in a number of ways. But I think that the first thing I want to make sure that we all take away is that the aid that the U.S. provides is both life-saving and it's life-sustaining. And I think that's something that we should all make sure we say in our meetings and whenever we're talking about this funding. Humanitarian assistance and the accounts that we talk about, it can sound a little bit in the weeds, but at the end of the day, we're actually talking about funds that save lives and sustain people's lives during their hardest times of their life. So that's really important to take away and make sure that you are emphasizing in your meetings. This funding provides immediate assistance. Please mute yourself, just a reminder. This funding goes to provide immediate assistance to those in desperate need. It provides short-term solutions and it provides permanent solutions for the displaced. Forcibly displaced people lack access to the most basic necessities of life, as Denise was talking about, including food and nutrition, sanitation, clean water, safe shelter, healthcare, education, support for psychosocial support for those who have been affected by the crisis. Obviously, being displaced is very hard, and many people have suffered post-traumatic stress. And services that these accounts that we're going to be speaking about fund actually go to help people while they're displaced to make sure that they can get through that tough time. And it also can help people find a livelihood. In many cases, people who are in displacement aren't even safe from conflict, war, and violence. And beyond this, the presence of large populations of forcibly displaced persons is an urgent security concern for the regions in which they reside. And it places tremendous resources on those countries whose resources are in many cases already stretched. And an example of this is in some countries surrounding Syria, like Jordan, Turkey, and other countries, where they've seen a significant outflow of refugees from Syria, their resources are quite stretched. And that means that children, for example, as Denise pointed out, half of refugees are children. Children in those countries have access to very limited, if any, education. And often they go in spurts where they only are able to go one day a week or a couple days a week. And their access to education is very, very limited, which is obviously deeply, deeply unfortunate for their long-term health and well-being. As the slide points out, the U.S. has long been the single largest donor of international humanitarian aid. When the U.S. steps up, others step up as well. But unfortunately, when the U.S. doesn't, other countries take note of that as well, and often will decrease their support. Unfortunately, the administration's budget for this fiscal year to come, which is fiscal year 2019, that budget proposes to cut humanitarian assistance by $3.1 billion. So that's 33% cut compared to the FY17 levels. Why do we have the FY17 levels there? Well, that's the last time that there was an Obama administration budget that, and then a Congress under an Obama administration passed appropriations into law. So we compare it to that last level of funding because it's our, of course, last indicator prior to the current administration. Like I was saying, U.S. funding helps to meet these basic needs of those persons fleeing persecution while they are displaced. It supports permanent solutions to their displacement, and it assists the countries hosting them, like I was mentioning. So while this cut is less severe, this 33% cut, it's less severe, in fact, than last year. Congress, again, is likely to express deep concern that this low funding level fails to keep pace with today's unprecedented global crisis. And beyond the numbers that we're mentioning here, these accounts actually go to help people who are also affected by famine. There's over 30 million, around 30 million people facing famine. It's a horrible number. And an example of that is in Yemen, which has obviously faced extreme hardship, war, violence this last years, and deeply, deeply affected. And some of these funds can go and help those who are internally displaced or those who've obviously fled their country. I'm not going to go over all of this, but I wanted to put this on here so you all saw it. So in the Leave Behind, which will be sent around to all you all, it was sent around today, but we'll make sure that it's sent around again. The Leave Behind that we're going to be giving members of Congress next week, it includes the accounts that we're going to be speaking about. This is FY18. It shows what was enacted into law. The president's request, which is obviously significantly different from FY18 enacted into law, and then we have the FY19 request. I think the reason I wanted to include this is because what you can see here is that Congress clearly did not take the president's FY18 request. That column isn't here, but as I was saying, it was the FY18 request was even worse than this FY19 one. And Congress said no. They said that's not the country that we stand for. That's not what we want to do. But honestly, there was an incredible amount of pressure on Congress to do that, and it's not a guarantee this will happen again. And it is immensely important that members of Congress on both sides of the aisle hear from their constituents, that's us, about what these accounts do and why they are so important. I will say the Emergency Refugee and Migration Account, it has $1 million there, but it's quite weedy. But in fact, there was funding that was in another account that actually fully funded it to the $50 million that we're requesting. But that's a little beyond where we need to get tonight. So I'm going to quickly talk about these three accounts, but again, I'm trying not to get too in the weeds. But the Migration, Refugee, and Assistance Account is administered by the State Department, and it's administered by the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration. This is a really, really critical account. It's the account that provides overseas assistance to refugees, so that 22 million number that we were talking about, this is the account where those funds come from, that the US contributes. So other countries obviously contribute to the international protection scheme, as we say, but this is the US's contribution. It also supports the admission to the US of the most vulnerable refugees. So as Denise was speaking about the US Refugee Admissions Program, this account is what funds part of that program. So this is a really important account. So if you have ever resettled refugees or assisted in that in your community, the first 60 to 90 days of that family or that individual's resettlement in your community, it came from this account. And it funds life-saving services in emergency situations. This account, again, it has bipartisan support, and I think that's something you should all mention when you're in meetings with your members of Congress. It has strong bipartisan support. It's long had strong bipartisan support. In fact, the whole refugee program has long had bipartisan support. It's only in recent years that has changed. It's important to emphasize that this is a program that has support. It has support in your community, it has support at the state level, and of course it has support, bipartisan support by members of Congress. The International Disaster Assistance Account, again, it's going in the weeds, and I don't think any of us need to remember this, but it is administered by the U.S. Agency for International Development. And it funds humanitarian assistance to people displaced by natural disaster, famine, conflict, and war. And so we provided some examples there, but it supports efforts to eradicate famine in countries including South Sudan, Nigeria, and Yemen, as I mentioned. It also helps to address longstanding humanitarian crises in countries such as Afghanistan, Somalia, Colombia, which have caused significant internal displacement and regional pressures. And it also assists in meeting the needs of internally displaced persons. one way to prevent them from becoming refugees. So an example of the IDA account in action is when there's an earthquake in a country. We might recall the earthquake in Nepal a few years ago. Well, this is the account where these funds go to. I mean, it's a team at USAID who immediately springs into action and is on the ground in practically hours to provide life-saving and life-sustaining support. There's that term again. Well, that's because it's true. It's not just a talking point. It's true. If the U.S. doesn't provide funds to help, there was thousands of people who died. There was many more who were injured as a result of that earthquake. If the U.S. wasn't there on the ground, can you imagine how those numbers would have been different? I don't even want to. So, that's just one example. There's countless. And finally, the Emergency Refugee and Migration Assistance Account, known as IRMA. It is an account that's also administered by the State Department, the same bureau that administers the Migration Refugee Assistance Account. It can only be drawn down via presidential authorization, which means the president is the one who says we can do this. But usually that decision is often made by the State Department, by the Secretary of State. I think a key word, if and when you're talking about this account, the key word to use is flexibility. It provides the flexibility to support relief to emergency crises without diverting funds from existing funding priorities. So again, when an emergency happens that was unforeseen, instead of taking out funds from other accounts which are already actively being used, this is an account which the president can use so it's just like we all have a range of basically what this. As a reminder, please put yourself on mute. It's a safety valve during emergencies, and it helps the U.S. to meet rapidly occurring and unforeseen humanitarian needs without having to stretch the resources of other accounts. And it provides a critical diplomatic and regional security tool. So before we move on to Sam's case, I am going to open it up to any questions. But before I do that, I do want to, because I also want to look at some of the questions we've had come in via chat. I'm actually going to administer a very short poll. So just 1 second. Really a simple question. It's, have you lobbied before? Yes or no? And just curious to see where we're at in the group here of who's lobbied and who hasn't. And then I'm going to give it just a few seconds, and then I will report out the finding.
Yes.
While we're waiting, while I'm letting everyone vote, we've had 60%, 62% vote. Ken asked a good question. Can you repeat what you said about the timeline of the chart? Can we use it in our congressional visits as a leave behind? Ken, you're more than welcome to use the chart. It's clearly stating the facts of how many arrivals we've had for the first 6 months of the fiscal year, which is October 1st through April 1st. And hello. Larry and others were good about answering.
Hello, can you hear me?
We certainly can. Do you have a question?
No, actually I joined a little bit late, so if there are any announcement, this is my first time, so I just want to be curious, yeah, because I am the member of Amnesty International USA, and I have been working in the same field for long when I was in Nepal. So yeah, this is the first time. I'm excited to join this.
It's so great to have you. Thank you for joining. We have about 40. We have I think over 40 people on.
Oh, great.
Muting ourselves when we're not speaking. But it's so great to have you. Great. So I'm going to end the polling, and I'm going to share the results. So About 3/4 of us have lobbied before, and about 1/4 haven't. So that's an interesting finding, and it's really great to have those who've never lobbied before, and obviously our people who've been doing this for decades in some cases, or years, and however long. We're glad to have you. Are there any other questions? I'm scrolling through right now, but are there any other questions that anyone wants to ask?
So what actually this lobby did?
Can you repeat your question?
Yeah, can you tell me something about what lobby is?
Well, I'd be happy to do that. So this is actually, today we're actually really going into depth on humanitarian assistance and
Okay.
I'm happy if you want to chat me. I'm happy to send. We have some amazing how to lobby videos, which
Great.
The series.
That is great. Yeah, that is great. Okay, we can go on that our topic. Okay.
This is Bob Pearson from New Mexico. Can you give us an idea of the timeline for the appropriations process to in place, and where can our representatives intervene in this process?
That's such a great question, Bob, and I'm actually really glad you asked it. So in terms of where we are in the process, like I said, we are currently in the fiscal year 2018. So we're a little more than halfway through fiscal year 2018. In February is when the president typically, and I believe did this year, sends his budget. I don't want to go too weedy in here. I certainly could, but that's basically when the appropriation season should start in Congress. And so typically Congress should pass a budget, and then Congress appropriates based on that budget. So where we are in the process, we have a budget, more or less. Congress has the ability to fund each of the accounts that we're talking about they have their high level amount, and then each of the appropriations committees really will go in depth, and that's where the accounts we're talking about tonight, that's where each of the committees goes to that depth to say this is how much each of these accounts should be funded at. We're actually this is such a great time for you all to be going to your members of Congress. It's actually probably the best time, because members of Congress, especially those who are on the appropriations committees, but all members of Congress have the opportunity to engage with the committees who have jurisdiction. And again, I'm really trying to not get too weedy, but I will say the appropriations committees, both in the House and the Senate, they're the committees that have jurisdiction over how much actually gets funded. And so in both the House and Senate, only a small percent of members are actually on that committee, and they're the ones who have a lot of power for how these bills get drafted. But all members of Congress, and we're going to talk about targets in a few minutes here, but all members of Congress have a voice, and they can sign on to letters. They can send a letter to the committee saying, these are my priorities. They can say, I urge the committee to do X. And then certainly, once the bills pass out of committee, and I'm sure we've all heard of the omnibus that gets passed, that's the bill that usually is what funds our government. Members of Congress, as that's negotiated mainly behind closed doors, members of Congress can say, I want the committee and I want those who are drafting this bill to fund these accounts at this amount. And again, that really happens from now through frankly, the end of September. I think and beyond. I think we can all know that Congress doesn't always meet its deadlines like probably most of us actually have to in our real lives. They often kick the can down the road and fund the government many months after they should. So that's a long-winded way of saying we are technically at the beginning of the process where appropriators are writing the bills, And this is a really critical moment where they actually are writing what will be the framework for the final bill whenever it's passed. And so this is the time when they need to hear from their constituents most. I really appreciate that question, Bob. I do want to move on, but is there any last questions about this section before I
Actually,
hand it off to Ashley?
My name is Mohammed Nouri. I'm from Oregon.
Hi, Mohammed.
Hi. I have been working with UNHCR and with refugees for more than a decade in different countries. And I was just wondering, because I haven't done lobbying for Amnesty International before, but I have done a lot of debate and discussions back in Geneva and other places, the UN headquarters. And sometimes some of these politicians are saying that resettlement has never been a practical solution to the refugee crisis, and that kind of a political gesture. If we are confronted with such a question, what is the best answer to that? Thank you.
Mohammed, great question. Can you actually broke out a little bit. Can you just repeat the exact question that you might encounter before we answer?
Yeah, my question was, if one of these congressmen or people we talk to, we lobby with, they say resettlement has never been a practical solution and to solve the refugee crisis, and is in fact a political gesture for the countries who resettle refugees. What is the best answer? Thank you.
Denise, are you wanting to answer that? Otherwise, I'm more than happy to.
No, I'm happy to answer. I mean, and in fact, I'm really glad that you brought up that question. Ryan and I were just talking about this earlier. Resettlement is only available for what the UNHCR calls the most uniquely vulnerable individuals. So people who are particularly cannot stay in the host country, such as children who are alone, torture survivors, people with severe medical conditions, LGBTI individuals, at-risk women and children. And so it's practical in the sense it's saving people's lives because they can't go home and they can't live in the host country. And again, it's a very small number. Last year, it was 160,000 around the world. This year, it's going to be 70,000. And so it's a practical solution that's a life-saving solution for people who can't go home and who can't live in a host country. And to give a very real example, I mean, I think we can all understand severe medical conditions. You might have to go where care is. But for example, LGBTI individuals, often they're persecuted because of their identity. And then they go to a third country, a second country, such as, let's say, Lebanon, if you're a Syrian refugee, or if you are from an African country and perhaps you go to Nigeria, where your identity is criminalized itself. So you go someplace to seek safety, but you could be persecuted there too. So you have to find safety someplace else, and that's what resettlement does.
Thank you.
Oh, great. So I'm going to answer one other question that came through chat, and then I'm going to move on to Ashley. And again, we'll open it up to questions at the end. We had a question from Cynthia. She said, can you give examples of support or services, and what does that money, quote unquote, buy? So I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question. I think if we're just talking about services for the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, and I think that the best way of thinking about it is it really is an investment. So these funds actually go to, when we're talking about refugee resettlement here in the U.S., those funds, it's not like we're just talking about thousands of dollars that just go right into a refugee family or an individual's pocket. That's just not how it works. They're actually an investment in the community in which that refugee is resettled. So if I'm from Seattle, Washington, and we have refugees resettled all around the region there. And when they come, they stay in an apartment, and so the funding, the initial funding for the first few months there, it helps pay their rent bill. It goes to utilities and groceries and household items, public transportation, and then again. So that's all in those first 60 to 90 days. In terms of where there's longer term services that come from a different program, which I won't get into today, but that's one way of looking at it. And so again, I think when you're talking about these funds, at least in the context of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, it really should be seen as an investment in the community and an investment in life saving. We just had a lobby day here in DC with resettlement partners all throughout the country. And we really talked about the economic benefits that refugees bring. They're countless, and they really revitalize our communities. I always like to say that, but end with the fact that ultimately it's about saving lives, and these are people's lives we're talking about. So that's just one way of answering that. There's lots of ways of answering that. Happy to talk about that further. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ashley, who will be speaking about Sam's case. So Ashley, take it away.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for your participation in the call today. This has, as Ryan noted, real world impact. And as Denise perfectly explained, this is indicative of a larger problem. So it isn't certainly just about Sam, but Sam's case is illustrative of the kinds of challenges that we're working from. Ryan, if you could move me to the next slide. There we go. So I know that there's a fair bit of text on this screen, and there's a photo. I want everyone to really feel as if you're able to immerse yourself in the story of an individual. And these stories are very difficult to capture. So as you can imagine, a refugee is often in a position where they are fleeing violence and persecution such that they can't share their story. They certainly couldn't share their photo. And so we're very appreciative to Sam and to his supporters for sharing his story with us. He's an Iraqi refugee. He has been in Cairo for more than 3 years awaiting resettlement inside the United States. He has a community and a family a chosen family of friends and former colleagues that are waiting for him inside the United States, including in the states of California, Illinois, and Texas, if we have any of those members on the call today. He was very close to being resettled. He was finally seeing light at the end of the tunnel after 3 years of waiting. But unfortunately, the third iteration of the refugee ban came down in October of 2017, which put him back into limbo. And even after a judge lifted the ban on Iraqis from the refugee ban in December and said that their cases needed to be moved forward in the resettlement infrastructure, Sam still waited. He's been put into additional bureaucratic red tape. And because the refugee ban actually expired in January, the administration has only alluded to additional security checks for refugees from countries like Iraq. So we've been waiting for someone like Sam to be able to arrive extensively. If you could pass along to the next slide. So what makes this case particularly egregious? We don't believe at Amnesty that any refugee is more or less deserving of resettlement or safety and security as other refugees. In fact, all refugees deserve to be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. We found that this case was particularly egregious because he has a home and a community and job prospects waiting for him inside the United States. And despite this overwhelming group of advocates, despite the amount of time that has been dedicated to his case, and the extensive vetting that he went through actually before he ever became a refugee, it's an example of how the system is breaking down. So Sam was an interpreter during the Iraq War and developed many friends through that process and developed many colleagues. He he has those colleagues waiting for him stateside. Unfortunately, the resettlement of Iraqi refugees has slammed practically to a halt. So I can count the number of Iraqi refugees who were resettled in the United States last month on two hands. Many of you might have seen that we have a similar crisis when it comes to countries like Syria. There were a number of news stories that came out that illustrated that Syrian refugees, only 11 Syrian refugees have been resettled since the beginning of the year. What we find most important in stories like this, and when we share them with elected officials, is to make sure that they're illustrative of the larger problem. Thanks, Ryan, this is perfect. It's emblematic of policies that are happening on a larger scale and to more refugees who are waiting in this system looking for a solution to that bureaucratic red tape. Whether it's a refugee ban, whether it's a presidential determination, or frankly just security checks or other checks that are keeping people from coming to the United States, it means that we're no longer even resettling the very low number that was set by the current administration. So this is a nonpartisan issue. We've resettled refugees to higher numbers, starting with President Reagan, who set a presidential determination of 110,000 refugees. And that refugee program was maintained through both Bush administrations, through Clinton and through Obama's administration. What we're seeing now is not normal. The number of refugees, as Ryan has said, was cut to 45,000, but we're not even slated to hit half of that by the end of the fiscal year. So if we've only hit a little more than 10,000 refugees by the halfway point, we're not even going to hit 22,000 by the time that the fiscal year is over. Another thing to note is that this has a real impact on the infrastructure itself. So if you were to look at this as a machine that stops and starts, it's very difficult to slow down the resettlement infrastructure and then hope to be able to bring in more refugees in the future. So what we really need is a strong defense now to keep that machine humming so that we're able to accept more refugees like Sam. And if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them on Sam's case or on refugees writ large.
Thank you, Ashley. If there's any questions at this time, otherwise we will move on. But while we're doing that, I'm going to use our handy dandy poll and ask one more question. Did you attend Amnesty International's Lobby Day in February? While we're, and again, really appreciate Ashley talking about Sam's case. I think one thing it's really important to note is you all should feel free to talk about this program, the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, as well as humanitarian assistance when you're talking about it, when you're lobbying on it to members of Congress, when you're talking about it to people in your community. I think the most important thing is to make it personal. And that's why we wanted to talk about Sam's case. We're obviously actively campaigning to get Sam here, get Sam to safety. But
Ryan, are you hearing me?
Yes, just one moment, if you don't mind. And then
Yeah,
now,
sure, no problem.
Just to say, I just wanted to say, it's really, if you want to use Sam's case, but you don't have to. You can talk about a refugee who you know, or you can talk about something in your community, your own experience. You might be a refugee yourself. But if you feel comfortable, you're more than welcome to talk about that. We have many Amnesty members spread throughout the country who've worked to pass refugee resolutions in their cities and their states. That's actually, we're not talking about resettlement with those necessarily or humanitarian assistance, but it's obviously you worked on refugee issues in your community. Talk about that. Make it personal. Show members of Congress why you care, why you spent the time to be in front of them, whether it's their staff or the member themselves. you should show them your passion, because if you can show them your passion, that will come through. So with that, I'm happy to take your question. Who was speaking?
Yeah, Kim.
Yes, did you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Actually, I forget her name who just presented right now.
That was Ashley.
Yeah, Ashley. Ashley mentioned that refugee, that problem, and relating to that Trump administrations. I'm curious to know what is this? That is there any initiative Amnesty International has taken with the Trump administration regarding this refugee scenario in the US?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, there is a campaign underway. And actually, if you were to Google Amnesty International USA SAM, one of the first two links that should show up should have ACT in the web address. And that is a petition that you can sign today that would go to the Department of Homeland Security. We're calling for the Department of Homeland Security and USCIS to expedite Sam's case and to also ensure that other refugees aren't held hostage by the system in the same way that his case has.
Thank you, Ashley.
Great, thanks for that question.
Have one question.
We had 58% of those who answered who had attended Lobby Day, and we had 42% who hadn't. So thank you to all those who did, and to all those who didn't. We're glad to have you, and hope that you continue to lobby with us both next week and in the future. Great. Let me see if there's any questions. I do want to, cognizant of our time, I do want to move us along. Larry asked, are we able to use examples of uniquely vulnerable refugees, such as those with medical conditions? If the answer is, are you able to do that? Yes. If the answer is, are there examples? There are obviously countless examples that we can use beyond Sam's case. Denise, are you still on?
Yeah, no, I can take this. I see Larry's question there. So this is like a research question. Right now, Larry, we're developing casework for the rest of the year, and we are looking at certain profiles of people. And so Ashley, who's the lead campaigner, she and I work closely to think about different cases, and then we consult, as you know, with members and staff. So we can add that right now. Right now, the profile is we're going to be developing an unaccompanied refugee minor, the child who has foster parents waiting here for him or her to arrive. That's in the initial stages. But this is something that I can definitely investigate to get examples for advocacy. I can't speak whether we can campaign on them or not. But I'm also working with Ryan to develop profiles for advocacy for June and for future just efforts.
To also answer your question a different way, Larry, I think when we talk about the vulnerabilities of refugees who are in need of urgent resettlement, that can mean those with medical conditions, that can mean children, unaccompanied refugee minors like Denise just spoke to, that can mean those who have an active threat against their life in the country in which they're residing, and they need access to resettlement because they cannot return to their country of origin, and their safety in their current country is at risk. So those are some other examples of those with unique vulnerabilities who require resettlement to a third country. And I think we've spoken about this, but just to say, there's the three durable solutions in resettlement, in a protection context. That's integration into the country that you've initially fled, a voluntary return to the country of your origin, or resettlement, which, as Denise said, is available to very, very few. Even though there are those who do, there's far more who need it than who actually are able to access it. Thanks, Larry, for that question. And Denise. So we're going to quickly, because we are running short on time, so I'm going to run through this. What are we asking Congress to do? Well, like I said, you all should have received Leave Behind, but we'll make sure that you all get it in your email again. We have 3 asks. Maintain robust funding for critical humanitarian aid accounts. Ensure refugee admissions goal is met this year, and support higher refugee admissions goal in fiscal year 2019, which Denise was talking about. And support robust funding for U.S. refugee resettlement program. These 3 asks are all in the Leave Behind, and the information that we've spoken to about tonight should give you some different ways of talking about those asks when you meet with your members of Congress next week. It's important to note that when you have a number of things that you can talk about in a short meeting, as you all know, especially the 75% of you who have lobbied before, you're not always able to go into the level of detail that you'd like with each ask. So sometimes it's best to just choose the one that you feel the most comfortable with, or the one you feel most passionate about. Speak to that, and then make sure that you do touch on the other asks, just to make sure that they hear from you and they know what they're being given. But again, it's really when you're meeting to talk about what you feel passionate about and what you feel most comfortable speaking about. Cognizant of time, I'm not going to go too deep into the counter arguments. That was sent around. I'll send it around again. There are a number of things that you can encounter when you meet with members of Congress. Usually these meetings are very respectful and people won't push you too much, but there's some different things that you can hear, including we can't afford to spend money abroad. When people are suffering here, we should provide aid to countries that are our friends and allies, or other countries should shoulder the burden. The document we sent around provides some different ways of answering those 3 common counter arguments. So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, just to say I think it's important to really focus on the positives. And there's all sorts of different ways that you can answer those questions if you feel comfortable. But ultimately, it's important to really emphasize the positives of the program, the positives of the accounts and the people that they serve. And frankly, it's a false choice to say we can't afford to spend the money abroad. The U.S. Spends less than 1% on our entire international affairs budget. It's a pittance compared to what we spend on other accounts, including our military accounts. So it really, really is a false choice to say that. And like we've also discussed earlier, other countries should shoulder the burden. Well, other countries look to the U.S. as leadership, and the U.S. really should continue to be a leader. When we step back, it really has an immediate effect on these programs served. I won't need to go into this too much because Bob's question prompted me to answer it, but just to say all members of Congress have a voice in the process like we were talking about. So it doesn't matter who you meet with, whether you're a congressional member or senator, is a Republican, a Democrat, if they're on the committee of relevance or not, doesn't matter. They have a voice, and if they say to you, oh, well, if the staff member says, well, my boss isn't on appropriations committee, my response would be, well, they do have a voice in this process, and as they should. And you can talk about, again, why this is important to you as a constituent. I always check, it's good to check, and again, this is in the lobby training, but just to say, check the committee assignments, and if they're on appropriations, it's good to mention that. Say, since your boss is on the appropriations committee, this is of particular relevance to him or her. And if time permitting in advance of the meeting, it's always good to just do a quick search or two. What's the member of Congress position on refugees? but I'll provide an example. Don't always get stuck on that, because just last week I met with a senator here in DC's their office, and their position had shifted, and they actually leaned into it and said, you know, our boss's position has shifted in the last couple of years as she's learned more, so, you know, don't lay into them if you see a statement or something else that might show a counter story. It's important to meet them where they're at in that moment, and use your power of persuasion. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Ahmed, who's graciously given her time this evening to provide her perspective. So Sarah, take it away.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, so Ryan was pretty great, and he kind of went over a lot of the lobbying specifics, and I just kind of wanted to reiterate a few of them, and kind of just go and speak a bit about to my experience, especially regarding Lobby Day that occurred this past February, because we did talk about, you know, humanitarian funding, and being the LC for Texas, a good number, if not all, of the meetings that I took were with, you know, very Republican offices. And Texas is one of the largest resellers of refugees, so I kind of, you know, go in to speak with from a personal, I mean, the state has a personal stake in it too, so I kind of wanted to go in and speak with them about that. And I was very surprised to see that, you know, a lot of the members of Congress did more or less agree with the positions that, you know, we were there to argue for. Because like Ryan said, these are not necessarily new topics. These are things that have been there for a while. And so, you know, it was good to hear that. A few concerns that did come up that I communicated with the DC office and I have written down from my meetings. You know, we got a lot of those, again, why should America be the one, you know, bolstering most of the burden and things like that, and to which, you know, the responses should always be a bit more on the positive side, like Ryan said, and, you know, we support less than 1%. I mean, less than 1% of our budget goes towards this, so like we can't afford to, and we as a global leader that we are, we should be doing more and encouraging other countries to do as well. And I think the one really important thing that I have to speak as LC would be to remind these members of Congress and these elected officials that they have constituencies that support these positions. You know, this is not just one or two individuals coming from Amnesty every 6 months or so trying to convince them of these things. These are, you know, most people in Texas, most people in what I know where you guys are living do support these positions, and it's a good thing to remind them of that. Definitely, you know, the story that Ashley talked about, Sam's story, you know, we mentioned other specific stories when we were talking about when we were training for Lobby Day in February. Stories do matter. They really humanize these, you know, the numerical information that we give out in these issue briefs. I always like to mention that, you know, half the refugees out there that we're trying to help are children. Like, these are real problems, and, you know, people being affected by them are children, and that really kind of hits home for a lot of these elected members. More so, I just wanted to kind of, you know, say that your LCs and all of this are a huge resource. I am here and happy to help, as I'm sure all the other LCs are too. And if we don't really know an answer to the question, we can definitely, you know, be the bridge and reach out to the offices in DC or whoever we need to and get you the information that you need. And, you know, if you or anybody else who has not lobbied before, because I know a few of you are here, check out our lobby videos, because, you know, they are a very cool resource that kind of really simplifies the whole process and make it a lot less scarier than it seems. So, yeah.
So much, Sarah. Really appreciate having you on. Does anyone have any questions for Sarah? Okay. Great. So we're going to open it up. If there's any other questions from the group at large, we're already over time, so I want to be cognizant of that. While we're waiting for any other last questions, I'm going to do one last poll. Do you plan to lobby your members of Congress next week? And you can say yes, no, or maybe. And feel free to say whatever, wherever you feel right now. I'm going to go back to a question that we had a little bit ago. Wanted to ask about, this came, and I might mispronounce your name, and I do apologize, Chol. I wanted to ask about the deportation of South Sudanese back to South Sudan, where the resettlement there is in the hands of the South Sudan government. Can the IRMA account help to resettle them in a safer location away from the government of South Sudan? I would just say, and Denise, please feel free to fill in. Again, with IRMA, that's a decision that's made by the president. So that emergency refugee migration assistance account is made by the president. Likely that funding to help would likely not come from South Sudan, and I would imagine that a number of countries, likely through the UN, would help with that. Denise, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I was just going to agree that right now with South Sudan and the refugee crisis there's already an effort to help with that, and it's certainly imperfect and more needs to be done, but the IRMA account wouldn't be applied to a situation like that, which is ongoing and being addressed by regional actors and by the United Nations.
I have asked some of the local representative here in regards to that situation, because similar to how the humanitarian aid funding is being cut, was what I've advised to them is that is also cutting some of the money that the families are having to use, because now they're having to send money back home to make sure that their family members find safety, because as we all know what's going on down there, as the government are using anybody that they have deported down there, you're either killed ethnically based on tribe, ethnic, as well as religion, and then what happens is nobody knows exactly what happens to that individual, because there's no accounts of who got sent down there and where their whereabouts are. So we're trying to figure out ways that can be able to help at least get them to a safer location where their family members at least know that they're safe there, or that they're not being used as governmental tools or just being killed in general.
Thank you for that perspective. So I'm going to just briefly share the results. So we had yes, no, and maybe of do you plan to lobby your members of Congress next week? 50% said yes, that's exciting. 42% said maybe, and 8% of those who answered said no. Well, guess what? I have assignments for all of you. For those who said yes, I'm so excited. I hope that tonight's issue brief has provided you some information that you'll use next week. And look forward to coordinating. If I know we have many LCs on the line, but coordinating with your LCs if you have them in your state. For those who said maybe, I hope you'll consider it. And those who said no, well, and the maybes, there's other opportunities beyond that. And be on the lookout. We're going to provide some opportunities for you next week. You know, lobbying in person, it's not always for everyone. And guess what? That's okay. There's other ways that you can make sure your members of Congress hear from you. And that really is the most important thing. You obviously all took the time to out of your afternoon and evening to be with us tonight, which we're so appreciative of. And we hope that you use this information to make sure that you're advocating for those who really have a really valuable role in this process, which is members of Congress. They are the ones who fund these accounts, and they need to hear from you, their constituents, on why they're important. So with that, if are there any last questions before we conclude?
Yes, this is Bob again with a question. I believe the last year under President Obama, about 100,000 to 110,000 refugees were resettled in the U.S. And I believe I've heard that about 10,000 of those were among the most vulnerable. Now, all the discussion tonight really has seemed to be on the most vulnerable refugees. Are they still a small, relatively small proportion of those who are being taken in or not?
Denise, I'm happy to answer this, but I want to turn to you first.
Sure. No. I'm happy to start. So, Bob, in the last year of President Obama's administration, 85,000 refugees were admitted. He had set the refugee cap for 110,000, and then President Trump slashed that to 50,000. So the last number under President Obama was just over 85,000 refugees. And by definition, if a refugee is resettled, that means that the refugee is what the UN Refugee Agency would say is uniquely vulnerable. So all of them are uniquely vulnerable by definition if they're considered for resettlement. Brian, I'll turn over to you.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it. Also to say that a number of refugees who come through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program are also family members. So, for example, Sam's family that Ashley was talking about, he hopefully will be able to be resettled here in the coming weeks or months, hopefully thanks to our advocacy. But his family remains stuck in displacement, and it's important that that he have that opportunity to be rejoined with them. So that's an example where family reunification is a really important part of the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program. It's why we actually advocate for a higher number. So when we say at least 75,000 refugees should be resettled this fiscal year, we actually think it should be more, but that's something that we feel is attainable number in this climate. And we certainly believe that those should be the most vulnerable, and also ensuring family reunification.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Jessica Lamb asked, no pressure, thank you for that, but when should we expect the recording for this to be available? Jessica, we're going to make every effort to try to get it out to everyone who participated tonight tomorrow. I'll do my best, but definitely you'll get it within the next couple of days. Let's see, were there any other questions? I may be able to lobby in Georgia next week. However, should my schedule stand in the way, I will be calling and letter writing as well as composing narratives based on tonight. I think that doing whatever works for you to share your story and call for change is important. Thank you all for being present tonight. I'm honored to participate. And that was from Kelly. And Kelly, I really appreciate that, and I hope everyone else takes lessons from that. Well, with that, the last thing I want to say before I close it out is once you're done, you're not done. Don't forget to fill out a debrief. That's available at amnestyusa.org/debrief. And please just take a few minutes right after your meeting just to fill out that debrief. It really helps us, and we take note of it. It helps for future lobbying members of Congress here. And it also helps us do our job better, as well as our LCs to do their jobs in their states. And also, you're not done, because we want you to continue to engage with us, continue engaging on the cases that we're advocating for, like Sam's case, and keep taking actions with us. We are so appreciative of everyone's time tonight. Again, we're going to send out this recording. We're also going to send out the materials that we referenced for all those who didn't get them. And again, really appreciate all of our speakers, Denise, Ashley, Sarah, for their time, and all of you for spending the time to be with us. We really appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.